The acrid smoke of burning cedar filled Rebecca Thornton's lungs as Comanche warriors cut through the ropes that bound her to the execution stake, their bronze hands moving with urgent precision, while the marauders who had murdered her husband lay dead around the smoldering homestead. Just hours earlier, the Crimson Riders had strung up her beloved James from their own oak tree, then prepared to burn her alive for refusing to reveal the location of their hidden gold mine, until War Eagle, the fierce Comanche war chief, arrived, with justice that came not from any law book, but from the ancient code of the plains. The Texas hill country stretched endlessly before Rebecca as consciousness slowly returned to her battered body. The year was 1847, and the frontier between civilization and wilderness had never felt more brutal or unforgiving. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She found herself lying on soft buffalo robes inside a magnificent teepee, the leather walls decorated with intricate paintings of horses, eagles, and scenes of hunt and battle that told stories older than any written history. War Eagle sat cross-legged nearby, his weathered face a map of countless battles and hard-won wisdom. At 45, he commanded respect, not just through strength, but through an intelligence that had kept his band alive during the most turbulent period in Comanche history. His dark eyes held depths that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "You are safe now, woman of the iron will," he said in careful English, each word chosen with deliberate precision. "The men who brought fire to your home will bring fire to no others." Rebecca struggled to sit up, her body protesting every movement. The last clear memory she had was of flames licking at her feet, while Ezekiel Morrison, leader of the Crimson Riders, demanded she reveal secrets she didn't possess. Everything after that was a blur of smoke, war cries, and the thundering of hooves. To understand how Rebecca Thornton had come to be tied to a burning stake in the Texas wilderness, one must travel back 18 months to a very different scene, in St. Louis, Missouri. There, in the parlor of her father's modest but respectable house on Chestnut Street, a young woman with golden hair and intelligent blue eyes was arguing passionately with every male member of her family about her future. "Rebecca, you cannot be serious about this Texas nonsense," her father, Samuel Hartwell, declared for the third time that evening. At 52, Samuel was a successful grain merchant who had built his fortune through careful calculation and avoiding unnecessary risks. The idea of his eldest daughter marrying a dreamer and heading into Indian territory struck him as the height of foolishness. "James has a solid plan, father," Rebecca replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "The land grants in Williamson County are practically free for families willing to work them. We could have our own farm, hundreds of acres, instead of renting a small plot outside the city." Her younger brother Thomas, home from his law studies, shook his head in disbelief. "Rebecca, Texas is barely civilized. There are Indians, outlaws, wild animals. It's no place for a woman of breeding." "What exactly is my breeding worth if I spend my entire life afraid to use it for anything meaningful?" Rebecca shot back. "Would you have me marry some merchant's son here in St. Louis and spend my days embroidering pillowcases and gossiping at tea parties?" The truth was that Rebecca had always been different from other young women of her social class. While they focused on fashion and social connections, she had spent her childhood reading her father's business correspondence and learning mathematics from her mother's brother, who taught at a local academy. By the age of 24, she could calculate shipping costs, understand basic engineering principles, and read Latin well enough to decipher legal documents. James Thornton had recognized these qualities immediately when they met at a church, social 6 months earlier. Unlike other suitors who seemed intimidated by her intelligence, James had encouraged her to share her thoughts about everything from westward expansion to agricultural techniques. He was a blacksmith by trade, but a dreamer by nature, with plans to establish not just a farm, but an entire community where families could build something lasting. "I understand your concerns," Rebecca had told her family that night, "but James and I have studied the opportunities carefully. Texas needs skilled craftsmen and educated settlers. We could build something important there, something that matters." Her mother, Elizabeth, had been the most difficult to convince. "Darling, you don't understand what you'd be giving up. The comforts, the safety, the society of civilized people. Once you leave for such a place, there's no guarantee you could ever return." But Rebecca's mind was made up. She had spent too many years watching other women surrender their dreams to social expectations. When James proposed marriage and partnership, in building a new life on the Texas frontier, she had seen it as the answer to prayers she hadn't even known she was praying. The wedding had been simple by St. Louis standards, but elegant by frontier expectations. Rebecca wore her grandmother's, a pearl necklace, and a dress of blue silk that would later be altered for practical frontier wear. James, handsome in his new black suit, promised not just to love and cherish her, but to build a life worthy of her intelligence and ambition. Their journey to Texas had taken 6 weeks, traveling with a wagon train of families who shared similar dreams of land and opportunity. Rebecca had kept a detailed journal during the trip, documenting everything from the daily challenges of trail life to the breathtaking landscapes they encountered as they moved steadily southwest. The land they had claimed near Cedar Creek was everything James had promised: rolling hills covered with oak and mesquite, a stream that ran year-round, and soil rich enough to support both crops and livestock. For their first home, they had built a solid log cabin with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace, planning to expand it as their family grew. For 14 months, their dream had seemed to be coming true. James had established a successful smithy that served not only their immediate neighbors, but travelers passing through on their way to Austin and beyond. Rebecca had planted a kitchen garden, raised chickens, and even started a small school for the children of nearby families. They had made friends among their neighbors, the O'Brien family from Ireland who farmed the adjacent property, the Martinez family whose ancestors had owned vast tracts of land under Mexican rule, and various other settlers who had come to Texas seeking the same opportunities that had drawn the Thorntons. But even during their happiest moments, there had been signs of trouble brewing in the region. Stories circulated about organized bands of raiders who targeted isolated homesteads, stealing livestock and supplies while terrorizing families into abandoning their claims. The local ranger company was spread too thin to provide effective protection, and appeals to Austin for additional law enforcement had gone largely unanswered. The Crimson Riders had first appeared in their area 3 months before the attack on the Thornton homestead. Named for the red bandanas they wore and the blood they left in their wake, this particular group of marauders had developed a reputation for exceptional cruelty, even by frontier standards. Unlike typical outlaws who struck quickly and moved on, the Crimson Riders seemed to take perverse pleasure in terrorizing their victims. They would often torture families for information about hidden valuables or simply for entertainment, leaving survivors traumatized and communities paralyzed with fear. Rebecca had first heard about them from Martha O'Brien, who had hidden in a root cellar with her 3 children while the raiders ransacked her home and killed her husband's prize bull. The Irish woman had been nearly incoherent with terror as she described men who seemed to enjoy inflicting pain for its own sake. "They weren't just stealing," Martha had whispered, her hands shaking as Rebecca served her tea in their kitchen. "They were playing with us like cats with mice. When they couldn't find any money, they started breaking things just to watch me cry." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. James had taken these reports seriously, beginning to carry his rifle with him when he worked outside and insisting that Rebecca keep a loaded pistol within reach at all times. They had discussed the possibility of temporarily retreating to Austin until the threat passed, but neither wanted to abandon the life they had worked so hard to build. "We can't let fear drive us from our home," James had said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the hills gold and crimson. "If we run now, what's to stop us from running every time something threatens our happiness?" Rebecca had agreed, though she had begun having disturbing dreams about men with red bandanas and cold eyes. In these nightmares, she and James were always running, always trying to reach safety that remained just out of reach. The attack had come on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the autumn air was crisp and clear, and Rebecca was hanging laundry behind their cabin. James was at his forge, working on horseshoes for a rancher from the next county, and the steady ring of his hammer on anvil had been a comforting soundtrack to her domestic tasks. She had noticed the dust cloud on the eastern horizon, but thought nothing of it. Travelers passed their way regularly, and James's reputation as a skilled blacksmith had made their homestead a frequent stop for those needing repairs or new tools. It wasn't until the riders had topped the ridge and she could see the red bandanas clearly that Rebecca realized their peaceful morning was about to become a nightmare. "James," she had called, but the warning came too late. The crimson riders swept into their yard like a tornado of violence and malice, surrounding the cabin and forge before either Rebecca or James could reach their weapons. Ezekiel Morrison had been exactly what Rebecca had expected from the stories. A tall, lean man with cold grey eyes and the kind of smile that promised pain. At 40, he possessed the confidence of someone who had discovered that intimidation and violence could get him anything he wanted from life. "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton," he had said with mock courtesy, dismounting from his black stallion with the fluid grace of a born horseman. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but we have urgent business to discuss." James had stepped protectively in front of Rebecca, his hammer still in his hand, but clearly outmatched by the rifles pointed in his direction. "What kind of business?" James had asked, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. Morrison's smile had widened, the kind that involves a certain gold mine that's hidden somewhere in these hills, the kind that could make us all very wealthy if we approach it properly. "I don't know anything about any gold mine," James had replied honestly. "We're farmers and craftsmen, not prospectors." "Now that's disappointing," Morrison had said, his tone remaining conversational even as his men spread out to surround the couple. "Because we have it on very good authority that you know exactly where to find a very rich vein of gold that was hidden by Mexican miners before the war." Rebecca had felt a chill of understanding. The stories about Mexican gold were legend throughout Central Texas, tales of rich mines that had been concealed when Texas won its independence, their locations known only to a few families who had either died in the fighting or fled south to avoid American rule. But these were just stories, folklore that grew taller with each telling. The idea that James or anyone else in their small community might have actual knowledge of such treasure was absurd. "You've been misinformed," Rebecca had said, stepping beside her husband despite his gesture for her to stay back. "We've never heard anything about hidden gold except in the same stories everyone tells." Morrison's eyes had fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Ah, but you see, Mrs. Thornton, our information comes from a very reliable source, someone who has reason to know your husband's business better than you might think." The implication that someone had specifically identified James as having knowledge about hidden treasure had sent ice through Rebecca's veins. Who could have given Morrison such information? And why would anyone want to target her husband specifically? I'm telling you the truth, James had insisted. Whoever told you I know about gold was either lying or mistaken. I'm a blacksmith. I work with iron, not precious metals. Morrison had studied James's face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth in his features. Then, apparently reaching some conclusion, he had nodded to his men. Well then, Mr. Thornton, I suppose we'll have to help you remember. What followed had been a systematic attempt to torture information from James that he simply didn't possess. Morrison's men had dragged him to the oak tree that shaded their cabin, the same tree where Rebecca had hung a swing in hopes of the children they planned to have someday. They had beaten James methodically, asking the same questions over and over while Rebecca screamed and fought against the men who held her. Through it all, her husband had maintained his innocence, insisting repeatedly that he knew nothing about any hidden gold. Please, Rebecca had begged Morrison, can't you see he's telling the truth? If James knew about gold, would we be living in a log cabin and working a small farm? Wouldn't we be wealthy ourselves? But Morrison had seemed beyond reason, driven by an absolute conviction that James was lying. The torture had continued for what felt like hours, until finally the Marauder leader's patience had run out completely. String him up, Morrison had ordered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. Maybe watching her husband dance will loosen the lady's tongue. Rebecca's screams had echoed across the hills as the rope had gone around James's neck. In those final moments, her husband's eyes had found hers, and despite his pain and terror, he had tried to smile. I love you, Rebecca, he had managed to whisper. Don't let them break your spirit. Then the rope had taken him, and Rebecca's world had ended, but Morrison hadn't been finished with his cruelty. After watching James die, he had turned to Rebecca with the same cold calculation. Now then, Mrs. Thornton, your husband was very brave, but very foolish. You have one chance to be smarter than he was. Where is the gold? Through her tears and grief, Rebecca had told him the same truth James had died protecting. There is no gold. We don't know anything about any treasure. Morrison's face had darkened with fury. You're willing to die for this lie? I'm willing to die for the truth, Rebecca had replied, surprising herself with her own courage. Very well, Morrison had said, but you won't die quickly like your husband. We're going to stake you out by that fire and let you cook slowly. Maybe the pain will improve your memory. His men had dragged her to the execution stake they had prepared, binding her hands and feet while kindling was piled around the base. Rebecca had closed her eyes and tried to pray, but her mind seemed frozen with terror and grief. The flames had been lit, and she had felt the heat beginning to build around her feet when the sound of war cries had split the air like thunder. War. Eagle and his warriors had swept down from the hills like an avenging storm, their ponies moving with the fluid speed of natural cavalry, while their war cries echoed off the surrounding cliffs. Rebecca's first glimpse of her saviors had been through a haze of smoke and terror, bronze-skinned men with faces painted for battle, carrying weapons that spoke of both ancient tradition and deadly efficiency. The Comanche attack had been perfectly coordinated, striking the Crimson Riders from multiple directions simultaneously while they were distracted by their gruesome entertainment. Morrison's men, caught completely off guard, had barely managed to reach their weapons before the warrior charge was upon them. War Eagle himself had ridden straight for Rebecca, his war lance glinting in the afternoon sun as he scattered the burning kindling with practice strikes. Two of his warriors had cut her bonds, while others had engaged Morrison's gang in fierce combat throughout the homestead yard. The battle had been brief but decisive. The Crimson Riders, for all their cruelty and organization, had proven no match. The Comanche warriors, fighting on their own territory, with righteous anger fueling their assault. Within minutes, most of Morrison's men lay dead, while the few survivors had fled into the hills on whatever horses they could reach. Morrison himself had been among those who escaped, though not before War Eagle's lance had opened a long gash across his shoulder, a wound that marked him for future reckoning. "The coward lives to spread fear another day," War Eagle had said grimly as he watched Morrison disappear over the distant ridge. "But his power over others has been broken. Word will spread that the Crimson Riders can be defeated." Rebecca had been barely conscious during the rescue, her body racked with pain from the burns on her legs and feet, her mind struggling to process the sudden transformation from certain death to unexpected salvation. The Comanche warriors had lifted her gently from the stake, their hands surprisingly gentle for men who had just fought with such deadly efficiency. War Eagle had knelt beside her as his warriors tended to her injuries with immediate field medicine that spoke of extensive experience treating battle wounds. "You fought well, woman of courage," he had said in his careful English. "Your man died with honor, and you faced death without breaking. Such spirits are rare in any people." Through her pain and grief, Rebecca had managed to ask the question that burned in her mind. "Why? Why did you save me?" War Eagle's answer had been simple but profound. "Because the Crimson Riders are enemies of all who love justice, because no woman should burn for secrets she does not possess, and because the spirits whispered that our paths were meant to cross." The journey to the Comanche camp had taken most of the remaining daylight, with Rebecca carried on a travois that War Eagle's warriors had constructed with practiced efficiency. Despite her pain, she had been aware enough to observe her rescuers with growing fascination. These were not the savage monsters that frontier newspapers described, but disciplined warriors who moved with purpose and intelligence. They spoke among themselves in their melodic language, occasionally pointing out landmarks or discussing strategy for the journey ahead. War Eagle had ridden beside her travois for most of the trip, occasionally asking how she felt or explaining features of the landscape they were crossing. His English, while formal and carefully pronounced, was remarkably sophisticated for someone who lived completely outside white civilization. "You speak my language very well," Rebecca had observed during one of their conversations. "I learned from a missionary who lived among us for 3 winters. War Eagle had replied. "Father Santos was a good man who respected our ways while sharing his own. When soldiers came to arrest him for helping Indians, we helped him escape to Mexico." The story had revealed something important about War Eagle's character. He was someone who judged people by their actions rather than their race or background, and who possessed both the power and inclination to protect those who earned his respect. As they had approached the Comanche camp, Rebecca had gotten her first glimpse of how these people lived when they weren't fighting for their survival. Children had run out to greet the returning warriors, their laughter mixing with the barking of dogs and the neighing of horses. Women had emerged from teepees to hear the news of the battle, their faces showing relief that their men had returned safely. It was a scene of domestic normalcy that stood in sharp contrast to every stereotype Rebecca had been taught about Indian life. These were families, communities, people who loved and worried and celebrated just like any other human beings. War Eagle's tipi had been larger and more elaborately decorated than the others, marking his status as a war chief without ostentation or arrogance. Inside, Rebecca had been amazed by the sophisticated organization of the space and the obvious care that had gone into creating both beauty and functionality. Morning Star, War Eagle's wife, had taken charge of Rebecca's medical care with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to tending warriors' wounds. Her herbal treatments had been remarkably effective, drawing out pain and promoting healing with a speed that spoke of generations of accumulated medical knowledge. "My husband says you refuse to break even when facing fire," Morningstar had said through War Eagle's translation. "Such courage commands respect among our people." Rebecca had learned that War Eagle's band consisted of about 60 people, warriors, women, children, and elders who had chosen to maintain their traditional way of life despite increasing pressure from both the American government and hostile settlers. They were neither warlike savages nor peaceful farmers, but something more complex, a people adapting to changing circumstances while trying to preserve what was most essential about their identity. As Rebecca's strength had returned over the following days, she had begun to ask harder questions about the attack that had destroyed her life. The puzzle of Morrison's absolute conviction about the hidden gold mine had troubled her deeply. His certainty had been too specific to be based on mere rumor or wishful thinking. Someone gave Morrison detailed information about James and me. She had told War Eagle during one of their evening conversations. Someone who knew enough about our situation to make the gold mine story believable. War Eagle had nodded gravely. Such betrayals are common when there is profit to be made. Who among your people knew your habits well enough to plan such deception? Rebecca had considered the question carefully, running through their neighbors and acquaintances in the area. The O'Briens were above suspicion. They had lost too much to raiders themselves to be working with them. The Martinez family had been helpful and friendly, but they kept largely to themselves. There was Dr. Samuel Prescott, who served the medical needs of families throughout the region and who would have had access to many homes and much personal information. There was also Jonathan Hayes, who owned the general store in the nearest settlement and who would have known which families had money and which were struggling. But the person who troubled Rebecca most was someone she had never suspected until she began thinking like a detective rather than a victim. Thomas Garrett was the local land agent who had originally sold James their property and who had been instrumental in encouraging them to settle in the area. He had visited their homestead several times to check on their progress and had always shown great interest in their plans for expansion. More troubling, Garrett had been asking pointed questions about their finances during his last visit, just 2 weeks before the attack. He had seemed particularly interested in whether they had found anything unusual while digging their well or working their fields. "You think this Garrett marked your husband for the raiders?" War Eagle had asked. "I think Garrett knows more about the gold mine story than he's admitted," Rebecca had replied. "And I think the only way to find out the truth is to ask him directly." War Eagle had studied her face carefully. "Such questioning could be dangerous. If this man betrayed your husband, he will not hesitate to betray you as well." "Then I'll have to be smarter than he is," Rebecca had said, feeling the first stirring of something harder than grief. "James died because someone wanted him dead and used Morrison to do their dirty work. I'm going to find out who and why." The war chief had smiled at her words, the first time she had seen genuine approval in his expression. "Now you begin to think like a warrior, but warriors do not hunt alone when the prey is dangerous. You would help me? Morrison's escape means he will strike again, probably against my people as well as yours. Finding the truth about who guides his actions serves both our interests." Rebecca had felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced since James's death. Hope. Not hope for the peaceful life she had lost, but hope for something else entirely. Hope for justice, for truth, for the possibility that her husband's death might not be meaningless if it led to Morrison's downfall. "What do you propose?" she had asked. War Eagle's smile had turned predatory. "I propose that we teach Mr. Morrison and his allies that some prey bites back." As Rebecca had lain in her borrowed bed that night, listening to the sounds of the Comanche camp settling in for sleep, she had felt the final pieces of her old identity falling away. The farmer's wife, who had dreamed of a peaceful life in Texas, was gone, burned away in Morrison's fire, along with everything else she had held dear. What remained was something harder, something that could survive in this harsh land, and perhaps even change it. She was no longer Rebecca Thornton, victim of frontier violence. She was becoming something else entirely, a woman who understood that justice sometimes required taking the law into your own hands. The transformation frightened her even as it filled her with purpose. She had been raised to believe in civilization, in the rule of law, in the power of institutions to protect the innocent. But James's death had taught her that sometimes the innocent had no protection except what they could provide for themselves. War. Eagle had offered her a choice. She could return to the settlements and try to rebuild the life she had lost, or she could walk the war path with him and his warriors. As she drifted towards sleep, Rebecca realized that the choice had already been made for her the moment Morrison lit that fire. She was going to war. The morning sun painted the eastern hills blood red as Rebecca Thornton drew back the bowstring. For the 100th time that day, her fingers raw and bleeding from the unfamiliar grip of the Comanche warbow. 3 weeks had passed since War Eagle had pulled her from Morrison's execution fire, and every muscle in her body screamed protest against the brutal training regimen he had designed to transform a civilized farmer's wife into something the frontier had never seen before. Again, commanded Stone Bear, War Eagle's younger brother and the band's master of weapons. At 32, Stone Bear possessed the patient intensity of someone who understood that small mistakes in combat meant large consequences in survival. Your enemy will not wait for you to find comfort in the bow's song. Rebecca gritted her teeth and knocked another arrow, forcing her protesting shoulders to draw the heavy buffalo sinew string back to her ear. The target, a painted buffalo hide stretched between two mesquite posts, seemed to mock her efforts. While Comanche children half her age could put arrows through a man's heart at 50 paces, Rebecca struggled to hit the broad side of a tipi at 20, but she was learning. Slowly, painfully, with every fiber of her civilized upbringing screaming against what she was becoming, Rebecca was discovering muscles and reflexes she never knew she possessed. More importantly, she was discovering depths of determination that surprised even War Eagle. The bow knows when you doubt yourself, Stone Bear observed as her arrow sailed wide once again. Speak to it with confidence, and it will answer with precision. The concept of speaking to weapons would have seemed absurd to Rebecca just a month ago. Now, after watching Comanche warriors perform feats of marksmanship that bordered on the supernatural, she was beginning to understand that their relationship with their tools was fundamentally different from anything she had known in the white world. War Eagle's training philosophy was simple but brutal. If Rebecca intended to hunt men like Morrison, she needed to become deadlier than they were. This meant not just learning to use Comanche weapons, but learning to think like a Comanche warrior, to see the landscape as an ally, to read human behavior like animal tracks, and to move through hostile territory as if she belonged there. White. Soldiers fight in lines, War Eagle had explained during their first training session. They march in formation, shoot in volleys, charge on command. This makes them predictable. Morrison's men fight like white soldiers, organized but rigid in their thinking. He had gestured toward the warriors practicing nearby, each moving with individual fluid grace, while somehow maintaining perfect coordination with the others. Comanche warriors fight like wolves, each one deadly alone, unstoppable in the pack. We use the land, the weather, the enemy's own expectations against them. This is how 20 warriors can defeat 100 soldiers. Rebecca had absorbed this lesson while learning to move silently through grass that seemed determined to betray every footstep. Hours each day were spent practicing what Running Wolf, the band's chief scout, called ghost walking, the art of crossing terrain without leaving sign that could be followed. Your feet think like white woman's feet, Running Wolf had observed with characteristic bluntness. Heavy, straight, fighting the earth instead of flowing with it. Until your feet learn the earth's language, your enemies will always know where you have been. The criticism had stung, but Rebecca had forced herself to accept it as necessary instruction rather than personal insult. Everything about her previous life had been based on controlling and dominating the natural world, clearing land, building structures, imposing human will on wild spaces. Learning to work with the environment instead of against it required rewiring decades of ingrained assumptions. Gradually, her movements had begun to change. Instead of forcing her way through brush, she learned to find the natural paths that deer and elk used. Instead of fighting the uneven ground, she learned to read the terrain and place her feet where they would make no sound. Most importantly, she learned to see the landscape the way predators saw it, as a collection of opportunities for concealment, ambush, and escape. But physical skills were only part of War Eagle's curriculum. The war chief was equally concerned with teaching Rebecca to understand her enemy's psychology and motivation. "Morrison is not insane," he had explained during one of their evening strategy sessions. "Cruel men often appear mad, but madness is unpredictable. Morrison follows patterns, which means his actions can be anticipated and countered. What patterns do you see in his attacks?" War Eagle had spread a crude map drawn on buffalo hide before them, marking the locations of known Crimson Rider raids with pieces of colored stone. He targets isolated homesteads, never settlements with more than 1 or 2 families. He strikes during daylight hours when most men are working away from their homes. He always has escape routes prepared through terrain that favors fast horses. Over pursuit on foot, Rebecca had studied the map, noting the clustering of attacks around certain geographic features. He's following the creek systems, water sources that homesteaders need, but also natural highways for quick movement. Good. What else? The timing isn't random either, Rebecca had realized, studying the pattern more carefully. The attacks come in groups, 3 or 4 homesteads, hit within a few days, then weeks of quiet before the next wave. War Eagle had nodded approvingly. Morrison plans his raids like military campaigns. He gathers intelligence, selects targets, strikes quickly, then withdraws to plan the next operation. This suggests he has a base of operations somewhere central to the attack zones. The implications had been clear. If they could identify Morrison's stronghold, they could turn the tables on the Crimson Riders by attacking them where they felt safe. But first, Rebecca needed to complete her transformation from victim to hunter. The opportunity to prove her growing skills had come sooner than anyone expected. 5 weeks into her training, a young Comanche warrior named Swift Elk had arrived at the camp with disturbing news. A family of German immigrants had been attacked by Morrison's men just 20 miles to the east, and 2 children had been taken captive. The family name is Muller, Swift Elk had reported to the assembled war council. Father killed, mother and eldest son wounded, but alive. The raiders took a boy of 8 summers and a girl of perhaps 10. They left sign pointing toward the Broken Hills. Rebecca had felt her blood turn cold at the report. The Broken Hills were a maze of canyons and mesas that provided perfect hiding places for outlaws. If Morrison was holding children there, rescue would be nearly impossible for conventional forces. But Comanche warriors were far from conventional. "We ride at dawn," War Eagle had announced. "Swift Elk, Running Wolf, Stone Bear, Spotted Horse, and myself. We will bring the children home." Rebecca had stood up without thinking. "I'm coming with you." The declaration had caused immediate controversy among the War Council. Several elders had argued that Rebecca wasn't ready for such a dangerous mission, that her presence would endanger the other warriors, that she hadn't yet proven herself in actual combat. War Eagle had listened to all objections before speaking. "Rebecca Thornton has trained hard and learned well, but this mission will test more than her skills with weapons. It will test her heart, her spirit, her willingness to do what war demands." He had turned to Rebecca directly. "The taking of children changes the nature of this conflict. We will not simply rescue them. We will send a message that such acts bring swift and terrible consequences. Are you prepared for what that means? Rebecca had understood immediately. This wouldn't be a rescue mission. It would be an execution. Morrison's men who had taken those children would not live to see another sunrise. I'm prepared, she had said, and meant it. The war party had departed before dawn, riding hard through terrain that would have challenged Rebecca just weeks earlier. Now, mounted on a paint mare that War Eagle had selected for her, she found herself keeping pace with some of the finest horsemen on the continent. The Comanche relationship with horses was unlike anything Rebecca had witnessed in the white world. These men didn't simply ride their mounts. They seemed to merge with them, becoming centaur-like creatures that moved with supernatural grace and speed across the broken landscape. Your horse knows you are still learning her language, running. Wolf had observed as they paused to rest the animals near a hidden spring. She obeys because she's well trained, but she does not yet trust you completely. How do I earn that trust? Stop thinking of her as a tool and start thinking of her as a partner. In battle, she must be willing to die for you, just as you must. Be willing to die for her. It was another example of the fundamental difference between Comanche and white approaches to survival. Where Rebecca's previous experience had taught her to dominate and control, the Comanche way emphasized partnership and mutual respect. As they had climbed higher into the broken hills, the landscape had become increasingly forbidding. Towering sandstone cliffs created natural fortresses, while narrow canyons offered countless hiding places for both predators and prey. It was country that favored defenders over attackers, which explained why Morrison had chosen it for his stronghold. Running, Wolf had scouted ahead on foot, returning with intelligence that confirmed their worst fears. The children were being held in a box canyon about 5 miles deeper into the hills, guarded by at least 8 men. The location was nearly impregnable, accessible only through a narrow defile that could be held by 2 or 3 riflemen against a much larger force. Direct assault would be suicide, Stone Bear had observed grimly. Even if we succeeded, the children might be killed before we could reach them. Then we don't make a direct assault, War Eagle had replied. We make them come to us. The plan he had outlined was audacious in its simplicity, using techniques that Comanche raiders had perfected over generations. They would create multiple diversions to draw the guards away from the children, then strike when the camp was divided and confused. Rebecca's role in the plan had been both crucial and terrifying. As the only member of the war party who could pass for a white woman at a distance, she would approach the canyon mouth openly, pretending to be a lost traveler seeking help. When the guards came to investigate, Running Wolf and Swift Elk would eliminate them silently, while the other warriors moved into position for the final assault. Remember, War Eagle had warned her, once you commit to this deception, there is no retreat. If they suspect a trap, they will kill you immediately. Rebecca had checked her weapons one final time, a Comanche knife hidden in her boot, a small pistol concealed beneath her ragged dress, and the war bow that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. I understand, she had said, and discovered that she truly did. The approach to Morrison's canyon hideout had been the longest walk of Rebecca's life. Every step had carried her closer to a confrontation that would either prove her transformation complete or reveal it as dangerous self-deception. Behind her, invisible among the rocks and shadows, War Eagle and his warriors had moved into position like hunting wolves preparing to take down dangerous prey. The guards at the canyon mouth had been exactly what Rebecca expected, hard men with dead eyes, who saw her approaching figure as either opportunity or threat, depending on their needs of the moment. As she had stumbled toward them, affecting the exhausted desperation of a genuine lost traveler, she had counted weapons and assessed positions with eyes that War Eagle's training had taught to see tactical possibilities rather than mere landscape. Please, she had called out when still 50 yards away. "I need help. My wagon broke down, and I've been walking for 2 days." The guards had exchanged glances, clearly debating whether she represented danger or entertainment. That moment of hesitation had been all Running Wolf needed to eliminate the outer sentry with a silent arrow through the throat. The remaining guard had started to raise his rifle when Swift Elk's war cry had echoed off the canyon walls, signaling the beginning of the assault. What followed had been a masterpiece of coordinated violence that reduced Morrison's supposedly impregnable stronghold to chaos within minutes. Rebecca had drawn her concealed pistol and put a bullet through the second guard's chest before he could fire a shot. The impact had sent him spinning backward into the canyon, and Rebecca had felt a surge of savage satisfaction that shocked her with its intensity. This was what she had become, a killer who felt joy in the death of evil men. Tessie's battle inside the canyon had been brief but decisive. Morrison's men, caught between multiple attackers coming from unexpected directions, had fought with the desperation of cornered animals but lacked the coordination and tactical flexibility of their Comanche opponents. Stone Bear had cornered 3 raiders in a natural alcove and dispatched them with his war club while they fumbled to reload their rifles. Spotted Horse had used his lance to deadly effect against 2 men who had tried to flee on horseback through terrain that favored warriors on foot. War Eagle himself had engaged the leader of this particular group, a scarred brute named Jack Rawlins, who had been with Morrison since the early days of the Crimson Riders. The duel between them had been savage and personal, combining the refined techniques of Comanche combat with the raw brutality that frontier life demanded. When Rawlins had finally fallen with War Eagle's knife between his ribs, the canyon had fallen silent except for the frightened sobbing of the Muller children. Rebecca had found them tied in a shallow cave, terrified but unharmed. 8-year-old Heinrich and his 10-year-old sister Greta had stared at her with huge eyes, unable to process the transformation of their apparent rescuer from lost traveler to deadly warrior. "It's all right," Rebecca had told them in the gentle German her mother had taught her years earlier. "You're safe now. We're taking you home." But even as she had comforted the children, Rebecca had been aware of a fundamental change in herself. The woman who had cut their bonds and lifted them to safety was not the same person who had approached the canyon mouth an hour earlier. That final approach had completed a transformation that weeks of training had begun. She was no longer Rebecca Thornton, farmer's wife seeking justice for her murdered husband. She had become something else entirely, a predator in her own right, someone who could kill without hesitation when circumstances demanded it. The ride back to return the children to their mother had given Rebecca time to contemplate what she had become. War Eagle had noticed her unusual quiet and ridden beside her as they descended from the broken hills. "You have tasted blood and found it to your liking," he had observed. "This troubles you." "Shouldn't it?" Rebecca had replied. "I was raised to believe that killing was wrong, that civilized people found other ways to solve problems. And what did civilization do to protect your husband? What did it do to protect those children?" The questions had no comfortable answers. Civilization, with all its laws and institutions and moral principles, had been utterly useless when confronted with men like Morrison and his riders. Only superior violence had been able to restore the balance. The taking of life should never be easy, War Eagle had said quietly, but sometimes it is necessary. The trick is learning to live with that necessity without letting it consume your spirit. It was a lesson that Rebecca was still struggling to understand as they had delivered the Mueller children safely home and begun the journey back to the Comanche camp. She had proven herself capable of violence, but the cost of that capability remained unclear. The successful rescue of the Mueller children had marked a turning point in Rebecca's relationship with War Eagle's band. No longer was she seen as merely a white woman under their protection. She had become a warrior in her own right, someone who had proven her courage and effectiveness in actual combat. But the mission had also revealed troubling intelligence about Morrison's operations. Among the papers found in the raiders' camp was correspondence that suggested the Crimson Riders were being supported by someone with access to detailed information about both settler and Comanche movements. "Look at this," Rebecca had said, spreading the captured documents before War Eagle in his teepee. Morrison knew exactly when the Muller family would be most vulnerable, when Heinrich Muller would be away selling cattle in Austin, when only his wife and children would be at the homestead. War Eagle had studied the papers with growing concern. The intelligence was too specific and too current to have been gathered by casual observation. Someone was actively feeding information to the raiders. This explains how Morrison has avoided Army patrols for so long, he had realized. He knows their movements before they know them themselves. The implications were staggering. If Morrison had allies within the territorial government or military command, then conventional approaches to stopping him were doomed to failure. Any plan shared through official channels would reach the raiders before it could be implemented. "We need to find out who's helping him," Rebecca had said. "And we need to do it without alerting them that we know." War Eagle had nodded grimly. "This kind of investigation requires moving carefully through the white world. You would be better suited for such work than any of my warriors." The suggestion had both thrilled and terrified Rebecca. Returning to white civilization would mean abandoning the clarity and purpose she had found among the Comanche, but it might also provide the key to destroying Morrison's organization completely. "I would need a cover story," she had said. Her mind already working through the possibilities. Some explanation for where I've been since the attack on our homestead. What if Rebecca Thornton had been captured by Comanche raiders and recently escaped? War Eagle had suggested with a slight smile. Such a story would explain any changes in your appearance or behavior, while allowing you to move freely among your own people. The plan that had emerged from their discussions was elegant in its simplicity. Rebecca would return to the settlements claiming to have escaped from Comanche captivity after months of imprisonment. The story would explain her newfound survival skills and harder demeanor, while providing a reason for her to ask questions about recent events in the region. But first, she would need to prepare for a deception that would test every skill War Eagle had taught her. "You must learn to think and act like the woman you were before," he had warned her. "If you seem too capable, too confident, people will become suspicious." It was perhaps the greatest challenge yet, convincing people who had known Rebecca Thornton that she was still the same person, when in reality that woman had died in Morrison's fire and been reborn as something entirely different. The final phase of her preparation had involved creating physical evidence to support her cover story. War Eagle's warriors had carefully inflicted minor injuries that would suggest rough treatment during captivity, while Morning Star had provided a ragged dress and worn moccasins that would support the story of escape and hard travel. "Remember," War Eagle had said as they made their final preparations, "you are no longer hunting simply for revenge. You are hunting for justice, not just for your husband, but for all the innocent people Morrison will kill if he is allowed to continue." Rebecca had nodded, understanding that her mission had grown beyond personal vengeance to something larger and more important. She was now the weapon that would bring down a network of corruption and violence that threatened everyone in the region. The night before her departure, War Eagle had presented her with a gift, a magnificent horse bred from the finest Comanche bloodlines. The stallion was coal-black, with white markings that seemed to glow in moonlight, and his eyes held the intelligence of a creature that understood his role in the coming conflict. "Shadow Walker will carry you safely through any danger," War Eagle had explained. He has been trained for war, but also for stealth. When the time comes for swift movement or silent approach, he will not fail you." Rebecca had accepted the gift with the gravity it deserved, understanding that she was being entrusted with something precious beyond mere monetary value. Among the Comanche, a war chief's personal horse was a symbol of ultimate trust and respect. Dawn had broken over the camp. Rebecca had prepared to leave the only place where she had found peace since James's death. War Eagle and his warriors would continue their own campaign against Morrison, while she worked to identify and eliminate the source of intelligence that made the raiders so effective. "When you have learned what we need to know," War Eagle had told her, "send word through the trading post at Cedar Crossing. Ask for goods to be delivered to Eagle's Nest. Running Wolf will understand and find you." Rebecca had mounted Shadow. Walker turned toward the distant settlements, carrying with her skills and knowledge that no white woman in Texas had ever possessed. Behind her, she left the only people who truly understood what she had become. Ahead lay a deception that would either expose Morrison's allies or destroy her completely. The trading post at Cedar Crossing buzzed with nervous energy as Rebecca Thornton limped through its doors. Her carefully crafted appearance of a woman escaped from Indian captivity, drawing immediate attention from the dozen men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. Her torn dress, strategically placed bruises, and the haunted look she had practiced for hours in War Eagle's camp told a story that required no words. Here was a settler woman who had somehow survived the unthinkable. "Sweet Mother of God," breathed Marcus Finley, the post's proprietor, dropping his ledger book as he rushed to her side. "Rebecca Thornton, we all thought you were dead, girl. Where in blazes have you been?" Rebecca allowed herself to sway slightly, gripping the doorframe with trembling hands that concealed calluses earned from weeks of Comanche bow training. "Please," she whispered, her voice carefully pitched to convey exhaustion and trauma. I need to sit down and water. They didn't give me much water." The men crowded around her with a mixture of curiosity and genuine concern, their voices overlapping as they peppered her with questions about her ordeal. Rebecca let their words wash over her while she studied each face, searching for any flicker of guilt or recognition that might identify Morrison's secret ally. Thomas Garrett, the land agent she had suspected, stood near the back of the group, his expression unreadable. Dr. Samuel Prescott pushed through the crowd with his medical bag, already assuming the authority that his profession granted him in frontier communities. Jonathan Hayes, the general store owner, was notably absent, a fact that Rebecca filed away for future investigation. "Give her some space, you vultures," Dr. Prescott commanded, shooing the other men back while he knelt beside Rebecca's chair. "Can't you see the woman's been through hell? There'll be time for questions after I've examined her injuries." Rebecca submitted to the doctor's ministrations while keeping her senses alert for any detail that might reveal the traitor's identity. Prescott's hands were gentle but clinical as he examined the carefully inflicted wounds that War Eagle's warriors had given her to support her cover story. "These look like rope burns," he observed, studying her wrists. "And this cut on your arm. It's recent but healing well. What did they do to you, Rebecca?" "They kept me tied most of the time," Rebecca replied, allowing real emotion to creep into her voice as she remembered James's actual torture. "The women, they weren't cruel, but the men, they said I was their property now, that I'd never see civilized people again." The assembled men muttered angrily at her words, their faces reflecting the racial hatred that frontier violence had bred on both sides. Rebecca felt a twist of guilt at manipulating their prejudices, especially knowing the kindness War Eagle's people had actually shown her. But the mission required her to become someone she despised, at least temporarily. "How did you escape?" asked Thomas Garrett, stepping forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. "The Comanche aren't known for carelessness with their captives." Rebecca met his eyes directly, searching for any hint of deception while crafting her lie. A war party left to raid somewhere to the south. They took most of the warriors with them, leaving only the old men and women to guard the camp. I managed to slip away during a thunderstorm 3 nights ago. Which direction did you travel? Garrett pressed. If we knew where their camp was located, we could organize a proper expedition to deal with them permanently. The eagerness in his voice struck Rebecca as suspicious. A legitimate land agent might be concerned about Indian raids, but Garrett seemed almost excited by the prospect of pinpointing a Comanche camp's location. I don't know, Rebecca said, affecting confusion. I was so frightened, so desperate to get away. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore, then walked until I saw the smoke from the trading post. Dr. Prescott finished his examination and prescribed rest, decent food, and time to recover from her ordeal. The other men gradually dispersed, but not before each had offered his sympathy and assistance in helping her rebuild her life. Marcus Finley provided Rebecca with a small room above his store, while his wife Sarah clucked over her like a mother hen, providing clean clothes and hot meals. The kindness was genuine, which made Rebecca's deception all the more difficult to maintain. But as the days passed, she began to notice patterns that confirmed her suspicions about the existence of Morrison's spy network. Rebecca spent her first week at Cedar Crossing carefully observing the rhythms of frontier community life, while allowing the townspeople to grow comfortable with her presence. She played the role of a traumatized survivor, gradually recovering her strength, asking innocent questions about what had happened in the region during her supposed captivity. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Morrison's raids had increased in both frequency and precision during the months since the attack on her homestead. The Crimson Riders seemed to know exactly when families would be most vulnerable, when freight wagons would be carrying valuable cargo, and when army patrols would be elsewhere. It's like they've got eyes everywhere, complained Samuel Morrison, a freight operator whose wagons had been hit twice in the past month. They knew I was carrying a strong box of bank drafts from Austin, knew exactly which wagon it was in and where I'd hidden it. Rebecca listened to such stories while helping Sarah Finley with the store's bookkeeping, a task that provided her with access to shipping schedules, correspondence records, and financial transactions that painted a detailed picture of the region's economic activity. What she discovered was a sophisticated information network that went far beyond simple criminal collaboration. Someone with access to multiple sources of intelligence was systematically feeding Morrison's organization details about potential targets, travel schedules, and security arrangements. The breakthrough came when Rebecca discovered a pattern in the timing of telegraph messages sent from Cedar Crossing to Austin. Dr. Prescott had been sending regular communications to the territorial capital, ostensibly medical reports about disease outbreaks and public health concerns. But when Rebecca managed to examine copies of these messages, stored in the telegraph operator's records, she found coded references that had nothing to do with medicine. "Fever outbreak among Murphy family requires immediate attention," read one message sent just 2 days before the Murphy homestead was attacked. Another spoke of contaminated grain supplies near Willow Creek, which preceded a raid on grain warehouses in that exact location. Dr. Prescott wasn't just Morrison's informant, he was the central coordinator of intelligence for the entire Crimson Rider operation. The discovery left Rebecca both elated and terrified. She had identified the traitor, but now she faced the challenge of exposing him without revealing her own true identity and mission. Confirming her suspicions about Dr. Prescott required Rebecca to take risks that would have been impossible without her Comanche training. Using skills learned from Running Wolf, she began conducting nighttime surveillance of the doctor's house and office, moving through Cedar Crossing like a ghost while the settlement slept. What she discovered was even worse than she had imagined. Prescott wasn't just selling information to Morrison, he was actively recruiting new agents throughout the territory. His medical practice provided perfect cover for traveling between settlements, allowing him to identify potential collaborators and establish communication networks. Rebecca watched from concealment as Prescott met secretly with Thomas Garrett. Behind the trading post, their conversation revealing the true scope of the conspiracy. "Morrison's getting impatient about the Comanche problem," Prescott was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "He wants their exact location, so he can eliminate them before they interfere with the bank job in Fredericksburg." Garrett nodded nervously. "The Thornton woman might have useful information if we could get her to talk. She spent months in their camp. She must know something about their movements and strength." "Leave Mrs. Thornton to me," Prescott replied. "I'll find a way to extract what she knows without arousing suspicion. Medical examinations can reveal many things." Rebecca felt ice form in her stomach as she realized how precarious her position had become. Prescott suspected she might have valuable intelligence about the Comanche, and he was planning to use his medical authority to interrogate her under the guise of treating her supposed trauma. She needed to act quickly, but first she had to get word to War Eagle about Morrison's planned attack on their camp. Getting a warning to War Eagle without exposing herself proved to be Rebecca's greatest challenge yet. She couldn't simply disappear from Cedar Crossing without raising questions, and any suspicious behavior might alert Prescott to her true loyalties. The solution came from an unexpected source. Young Billy Carpenter, the telegraph operator's assistant, had developed an obvious infatuation with the brave lady who escaped from the Indians. His puppy dog devotion provided Rebecca with the perfect opportunity to send a coded message. "Billy," she said one morning as he delivered a telegraph to the trading post, "I've been thinking about my poor husband's grave. Do you think someone could carry a message to Father Santos at the mission near Eagle's Nest? I'd like to have proper prayers said for James's soul." Billy's face lit up with eagerness to help. "Of course, Mrs. Thornton. I know a reliable rider who makes regular trips in that direction. What would you like the message to say?" Rebecca crafted her words carefully, knowing that War Eagle would understand the hidden meaning. "Please ask Father Santos to pray for the souls of those who will fall when the red dawn comes to Eagle's Nest. The fever that has plagued our region grows worse, and I fear it will spread to the sacred places where good men seek peace." The message would warn War Eagle about Morrison's planned attack, while appearing to be nothing more than a grieving widow's request for spiritual comfort. Billy promised to have the message delivered within 2 days, giving War Eagle time to move his people to safety or prepare an ambush for Morrison's forces. Dr. Prescott made his move 3 days later, inviting Rebecca to his office for what he claimed was a routine follow-up examination to assess her recovery from her ordeal. "I'm concerned about some lingering effects of your captivity," he explained with professional concern. "Sometimes traumatic experiences can cause memory problems or other psychological difficulties that require treatment." Rebecca agreed to the appointment, knowing it would provide her with the opportunity to confront Prescott while having some control over the circumstances. She arrived at his office carrying a concealed knife and mentally prepared for violence if necessary. Prescott's examination began routinely enough, but gradually shifted toward questions that had nothing to do with her physical health. "Tell me about the Comanche camp where you were held," he said, his tone remaining clinical even as his questions became more specific. "How many warriors did you observe? What weapons did they possess? Were there any white men among them who might have been advising them?" Rebecca played along for several minutes, providing vague answers that revealed nothing useful while confirming her suspicions about Prescott's true motives. "Doctor," she said finally, "these questions seem more suited to a military intelligence officer than a physician. Are you treating my health or gathering information for someone else? Prescott's mask of professional concern slipped slightly. Mrs. Thornton, your experiences could provide valuable intelligence about Indian capabilities and intentions. Surely you understand the importance of helping protect other families from the fate that befell yours. The fate that befell my family was caused by white men, not Indians, Rebecca replied, letting steel enter her voice. Men like Morrison, who murder innocent people for profit. Men like you, who sell information to murderers. The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Prescott's face cycled through surprise, calculation, and finally cold resolve. You know, he said quietly, reaching for a medical bag that Rebecca now realized probably contained weapons rather than medicines. I suspected you might have learned more during your captivity than a simple farm wife should know. I learned that some monsters wear civilized faces, Rebecca replied, her hand moving toward her concealed knife. I learned that sometimes justice requires taking matters into your own hands. Prescott drew a small pistol from his bag, but Rebecca was already moving. Weeks of training with Stone Bear had taught her that the first rule of combat was never to wait for your enemy to complete his preparations. Her knife took Prescott in the throat before he could bring his weapon to bear, ending his treachery with swift and silent efficiency. As he collapsed behind his desk, Rebecca felt the same cold satisfaction she had experienced during the canyon rescue. Another of Morrison's allies was dead, but the network was larger than just one man. Prescott's. Death needed to appear accidental if Rebecca was to avoid suspicion and continue her mission. Using knowledge of frontier medicine gained from watching Morning Star work, she arranged the scene to suggest that the doctor had suffered a fatal accident while handling medical instruments. The discovery of his body the next morning caused shock throughout Cedar Crossing, but no one suspected murder. Dr. Prescott had been well regarded in the community, and the idea that someone might want him dead seemed impossible to most of the townspeople. Rebecca attended his funeral with appropriate solemnity, while mentally cataloguing which other community members might be part of Morrison's network. Thomas Garrett's suspicious behavior during the past week had marked him as a probable collaborator, and there were likely others she hadn't yet identified. But time was running short. Morrison's planned attack on the Comanche camp was scheduled for the following week, and Rebecca needed to complete her mission and return to War Eagle's side before the final confrontation. The end game was approaching, and Rebecca Thornton was ready to finish what Morrison had started when he murdered her husband and tried to burn her alive. The full moon cast silver shadows across the abandoned Spanish mission of San Rafael as Rebecca Thornton waited in the crumbling bell tower, her Comanche war bow strung and ready, while 40 feet below, Ezekiel Morrison walked straight into the trap she had spent 2 weeks preparing. The irony was perfect. The same man who had tried to burn her alive for information about non-existent gold was now pursuing phantom intelligence about a fictional Comanche war party, lured by messages that promised him everything he had killed. For Rebecca had sent word through carefully selected channels that a survivor from the destroyed Comanche camp possessed detailed information about hidden weapons caches and planned attacks on Fredericksburg. Morrison, driven by his obsession with controlling every threat in his territory, had taken the bait completely. Now he stood in the mission's main chapel with only 3 of his most trusted lieutenants, believing he was meeting a terrified settler who would trade Comanche secrets for protection. Instead, he was about to face the woman whose husband he had murdered, backed by warriors who moved through darkness like avenging spirits. The events leading to this confrontation had unfolded with the methodical precision that War Eagle had taught Rebecca to appreciate in all successful hunts. After eliminating Dr. Prescott and disrupting Morrison's intelligence network, she had needed to force the Crimson Rider leader into a position where he could be isolated and destroyed. Her opportunity had come through Thomas Garrett, the Land agent whose nervous behavior had marked him as a weak link in Morrison's organization. Rather than eliminating him immediately, Rebecca had chosen to turn him into an unwitting weapon against his former allies. The manipulation had required returning to Cedar Crossing with disturbing news about her recovery. She had approached Garrett privately, claiming that her traumatic memories were beginning to return, and that she was remembering details about the Comanche camp that might be valuable to the authorities. "I keep having nightmares about their war council," she had told Garrett with carefully crafted anxiety. "They were planning something terrible for Fredericksburg, talking about hidden weapons and coordinated attacks with other bands." Garrett's reaction had confirmed his role in Morrison's network. Instead of suggesting she report this information to the army or territorial authorities, he had immediately asked whether she would be willing to share these details with certain people who could make better use of such intelligence. "There are men better equipped than soldiers to handle Indian problems," he had explained. "Men who understand how to deal with savages permanently." Rebecca had agreed to meet with these mysterious men, knowing that Garrett would contact Morrison directly rather than risk exposing other members of the network. The Land agent's greed and cowardice made him predictable, which made him useful. The meeting location she had suggested, the abandoned Spanish mission of San Rafael, had been chosen for tactical advantages that Morrison wouldn't recognize until too late. The mission's isolation would prevent escape or reinforcement, while its crumbling architecture provided perfect concealment for War Eagle's warriors. War Eagle himself had arrived at the mission 3 days before the scheduled meeting, bringing with him a hand-picked force of 12 warriors whose skills Rebecca had witnessed during the canyon rescue. They had spent those 3 days transforming the ruins into a killing ground, positioning themselves with the patience of hunters who understood that the perfect shot was worth any amount of waiting. "Morrison will not escape this place," War Eagle had promised, as they made their final preparations. "But you must be the one to take his life. Your husband's spirit demands that justice come from your hand." Rebecca had accepted this responsibility without hesitation. The woman who had once hung laundry behind a peaceful cabin was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that some debts could only be paid in blood. Morrison's entrance into the mission had been exactly what Rebecca had expected. Cautious, but not cautious enough. Confident in his ability to handle whatever threats might emerge from dealing with a traumatized farm wife. He had brought only 3 men with him, leaving the rest of his gang at their camp in the Broken Hills. "Mrs. Thornton," Morrison had called out as he stepped through the chapel's main entrance, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I understand you have information that might be of mutual benefit." Rebecca had remained hidden in the bell tower, watching through gaps in the ancient stonework as Morrison and his men positioned themselves in the center of the chapel. They were good. Their formation provided overlapping fields of fire while keeping escape routes open, but they were thinking like men, fighting other men, not like men being hunted by Comanche warriors who had been perfecting the art of ambush for generations. "I'm here," Rebecca had called down, her voice carrying the perfect note of nervous fear. "But I need to know you're not going to hurt me, like your men hurt my husband." Morrison's laugh had been cold and mocking. "Mrs. Thornton, your husband died because he was stubborn and foolish. You have the opportunity to be smarter than he was." The casual dismissal of James's murder had sent rage coursing through Rebecca's veins, but she had forced herself to maintain the deception a little longer. Every second Morrison spent in the chapel was another second for War Eagle's warriors to tighten the noose around him. "What do you want to know?" she had asked. affecting. The broken voice of a woman pushed beyond her limits. Everything, Morrison had replied. The location of their main camp, the number of warriors, their weapons, their plans for Fredericksburg, leave nothing out. Rebecca had begun to spin a carefully crafted tale of Comanche preparations for a massive assault on the German settlements, weaving together real tactical knowledge with fictional details designed to keep Morrison engaged and stationary. As she spoke, she had watched shadows move among the mission's ruined walls, War Eagle's warriors flowing into position like smoke given deadly form. "They have rifles," she had said, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her fabrication. "More rifles than I expected. And ammunition. They spoke of a white man who brings them weapons in exchange for stolen cattle." This detail had caught Morrison's attention immediately. "What white man? Describe him." "I don't know his name," Rebecca had lied smoothly. "But they called him Ghost Walker because he could move through army patrols without being detected." The fictional arms dealer had been inspired by real concerns about gun runners operating along the frontier, and Morrison's reaction confirmed that such men were indeed active in the region. His intelligence network worked both ways. He sold information to raiders while buying weapons from smugglers. "Where do these meetings take place?" Morrison had pressed. "When is the next delivery scheduled?" Rebecca had been about to respond when Running Wolf's war cry had shattered the night air, signaling the beginning of the assault that would end Morrison's reign of terror forever. The attack had unfolded with the devastating precision that made Comanche warriors legendary throughout the frontier. War Eagle's men had struck from 6 different directions simultaneously, their arrows finding targets before Morrison's gang could even identify where the assault was coming from. 2 of Morrison's lieutenants had died in the first volley, their rifles clattering uselessly to the stone floor as Running Wolf and Swift Elk had emerged from concealment behind the altar. The 3rd man had managed to get off a wild shot before Stone Bear's war club had crushed his skull with surgical precision. Morrison himself had proven why he had survived so long in a violent profession. Instead of panicking or trying to fight his way out of an impossible situation, he had immediately sought cover behind a massive stone pillar while drawing both of his revolvers. "Rebecca Thornton!" he had shouted over the echoing war cries. "I should have known that no farm wife could survive what you claimed to survive." Rebecca had descended from the bell tower with her bow ready, moving with the fluid silence that Stone Bear had drilled into her over weeks of relentless training. Morrison was trapped, but still dangerous, a wounded animal fighting for survival. "With nothing left to lose, you murdered my husband for gold that didn't exist," she had called out as she positioned herself where Morrison couldn't escape without exposing himself to her shot. "You tried to burn me alive for information I didn't have. Now you're going to pay for both crimes." Morrison's response had been a vicious laugh that echoed off the chapel walls. "Your husband died because he was in the way, Rebecca, just like you were supposed to die because you were in the way." This was never about gold. The admission had hit Rebecca like a physical blow. "What are you talking about? Your precious homestead sits on the most valuable land in central Texas," Morrison had explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man revealing his greatest triumph. "Not for gold, but for water. There's an underground river running beneath your property that could irrigate thousands of acres. Certain people wanted that land, and your husband's legal claim was an obstacle." The truth had been more horrifying than Rebecca had imagined. James hadn't died for treasure that didn't exist. He had died for water rights that were worth a fortune. To the right investors. "Who?" she had demanded. "Who wanted our land?" "Men with enough money to buy territorial judges and army officers," Morrison had replied. "Men who needed your husband dead and your claim abandoned so they could file their own papers." Rebecca had felt the final pieces of the conspiracy falling into place. The attack on their homestead hadn't been random violence. It had been a carefully orchestrated murder designed to clear the way for a massive land grab. "It doesn't matter now," Morrison had continued. "You're all going to die in this ruin, and those water rights will still change hands. The only difference is that I'll have to collect my payment from a grave." He had chosen that moment to break from cover, both revolvers blazing as he tried to fight his way past War Eagle's warriors toward the chapel's side entrance. The desperate gambit had almost succeeded. Morrison was faster and more experienced than most men could handle. But he wasn't facing most men. He was facing Comanche warriors, trained from childhood to fight and kill, led by a war chief whose tactical brilliance had kept his people alive through the most dangerous period in their history. War Eagle himself had stepped into Morrison's path, his lance moving with the deadly precision of a striking serpent. The obsidian point had taken Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending one of his revolvers skittering across the stone floor. Morrison had gone down hard but not finished, his remaining revolver still clutched in his left hand. As he tried to bring it to bear on War Eagle, the war chief had been forced to dodge behind a pillar, giving Morrison a momentary respite to gather himself for a final stand. It was then that Rebecca had made her choice. Moving with the ghost-walking skills Running Wolf had taught her, she had closed the distance between herself and Morrison, while he was focused on War Eagle's position. Morrison had sensed her approach at the last second, turning to face her with his revolver raised, but Rebecca had already released her arrow, the Comanche war point, taking him center mass with enough force to punch through his body and embed itself in the stone wall behind him. Morrison had looked down at the arrow shaft protruding from his chest with something that might have been surprise. When he looked back up at Rebecca, his expression had been almost admiring. "I underestimated you," he had said, blood beginning to foam at the corners of his mouth. "That was my mistake. Your mistake was thinking you could murder innocent people without consequences," Rebecca had replied, knocking another arrow, though she knew it wouldn't be necessary. Morrison had slumped against the pillar, his life bleeding away onto the ancient stones. "The water rights," he had managed to whisper. "Check the Territorial Land Office, Austin. Judge Morrison, no relation, has been bought. Papers already filed." With those final words, Ezekiel Morrison had died, taking with him the secrets of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Rebecca had stood over his body, feeling neither triumph nor satisfaction, only a cold emptiness where her desire for revenge had been. Justice was done, but James was still dead, their dreams still shattered. War Eagle had approached her as his warriors secured the mission and tended to their own minor wounds. "It is finished," he had said simply. "Your husband's spirit can rest." "Part of it is finished," Rebecca had corrected. "Morrison was just the weapon. The men who hired him are still alive, still planning to steal our land." War Eagle had nodded grimly. "Then our war continues. But now we fight a different kind of enemy, men who hide behind law and politics instead of facing their enemies with honest weapons." Rebecca had looked around the chapel, where so much blood had been spilled in the name of water rights and territorial expansion. The mission had been built by Spanish priests who had come to this land seeking souls to save. Now it had become the site of a reckoning that those priests could never have imagined. "I need to get to Austin," she had said. If Morrison was telling the truth about the land office, there might still be time to stop the transfer. "And if there is not time?" Rebecca had smiled, an expression that would have terrified anyone who had known her as a farmer's wife. "Then Judge Morrison and his co-conspirators will learn the same lesson their hired killer just learned. Some things are worth killing for?" War Eagle had returned her smile with one of his own. "You have become more Comanche than white, Rebecca Thornton. Your heart now beats with the rhythm of a warrior." As they had prepared to leave the mission behind, Rebecca had looked back one final time at Morrison's body. The man who had destroyed. Her world was dead, but the world he had revealed, a world where innocent people could be murdered for water rights and judges could be bought like cattle, still existed. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The oak-paneled chambers of the territorial courthouse in Austin fell silent as Rebecca Thornton walked through the mahogany doors, her appearance causing every conversation to die mid-sentence. Gone was any pretense of the traumatized captive or grieving widow. She entered as something entirely new in Texas politics, a woman who commanded attention through presence alone. The elegant emerald dress she wore had been purchased that morning with gold coins taken from Morrison's body. But beneath the civilized facade, everyone could sense something wild and dangerous that no amount of finery could fully conceal. Judge Harrison Morrison, no relation to the dead outlaw despite sharing his surname, looked up from the land transfer documents spread across his bench with barely concealed irritation. At 55, he had grown accustomed to conducting his corrupt business without interference, protected by a network of bought officials and intimidated witnesses. The idea that a mere woman might pose a threat to his carefully constructed empire seemed almost absurd, but Rebecca was no longer a mere woman. She was a predator who had learned to hunt in both wilderness and civilization, and she had come to collect a debt that couldn't be paid with money. Austin in 1847 was a city caught between frontier roughness and political ambition, where men who had fought Mexican armies just years earlier now wore silk vests and debated constitutional law in marble halls. Rebecca had arrived 3 days before the scheduled land transfer, using that time to study the enemy's territory with the same methodical approach War Eagle had taught her for analyzing hostile terrain. The corruption surrounding her husband's murder ran deeper than even Morrison's dying confession had suggested. Through careful investigation at the Territorial Land Office, the courthouse records, and the private offices of Austin's legal establishment, Rebecca had uncovered a conspiracy that involved not just Judge Morrison, but also 2 territorial legislators, a federal land commissioner, and the president of Austin's largest bank. They had identified the underground river beneath the Thornton homestead through geological surveys commissioned under false pretenses, then orchestrated James's death to clear the title so they could claim the water rights through fraudulent filing. The planned development would have made them all wealthy beyond imagination, turning thousands of acres of seemingly worthless scrubland into the most valuable agricultural property in Central Texas. The beauty of their scheme lay in its legal sophistication. By having James murdered by outlaws rather than challenging his claim through courts, they had avoided creating any official record of their interest in the property. When Rebecca failed to return from her supposed Indian captivity, the land would eventually revert to territorial control, allowing them to purchase it legitimately at public auction. Everything had been planned perfectly, except for one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated the woman they were trying to destroy. Rebecca's campaign to expose the conspiracy had begun with careful documentation of every piece of evidence she could gather. Using skills learned from managing her father's shipping business, she had traced financial connections, copied correspondence, and built an irrefutable case that connected each conspirator to the others through a web of payments, communications, and coordinated actions. But documentation alone wouldn't be enough to bring down men who controlled the very legal system that should have held them accountable. Rebecca needed leverage that went beyond mere evidence. She needed the kind of power that could force corrupt officials to choose between confession and destruction. The solution had come from an unexpected source. During her investigation, Rebecca had discovered that Judge Morrison's corruption extended far beyond the Thornton land case. He had been systematically taking bribes to influence everything from railroad rights-of-way to mining claims, building a personal fortune through the systematic betrayal of his judicial oath. More importantly, he had been skimming money from territorial development funds intended for military fortifications, money that was desperately needed to defend Austin from potential Mexican retaliation. This particular crime constituted treason against the Republic of Texas, punishable by death even for sitting judges. Rebecca's entrance into Judge Morrison's chambers had been carefully timed to coincide with a private meeting between the judge and his co-conspirators, all of whom were present to finalize the fraudulent land transfer. The sight of the supposedly dead Rebecca Thornton walking into their secret gathering had created exactly the shock she had hoped for. "Gentlemen," she had said with deceptive calm, closing the chamber doors behind her and turning the key with deliberate emphasis. "I believe you've been conducting business that concerns me." Judge Morrison had recovered from his initial surprise with admirable speed, his politician's instincts taking over even in the face of what should have been an impossible situation. "Mrs. Thornton," he had said with practiced warmth, "what a remarkable blessing to see you alive and well. We had all feared the worst when you disappeared during that terrible Indian attack. Your concern is touching, Judge Morrison, especially considering that you ordered my death." The accusation had hung in the air like a challenge, while the other conspirators, State Representative William Hayes, Federal Land Commissioner Joseph Bradford, and Bank President Charles Whitman, had shifted nervously in their leather chairs. "That's a very serious accusation," Morrison had replied carefully. "I hope you have substantial evidence to support such a claim." Rebecca had smiled with the cold confidence of someone holding all the winning cards. "I have Morrison's confession. Before he died, I have documented proof of your financial arrangements with his organization. I have copies of your correspondence discussing the timeline for eliminating obstacles to your land acquisition." She had placed a thick folder of documents on Morrison's desk, the contents representing weeks of careful investigation and documentation. "But most importantly," she had continued, "I have evidence of your theft from territorial defense funds. That makes you not just a murderer, but a traitor to the Republic of Texas." The last revelation had drained the color from Morrison's face. Corruption was one thing. In frontier politics, it was almost expected, but treason carried consequences that no amount of influence could deflect. "What do you want?" Morrison had asked, abandoning any pretense of innocence. "Justice," Rebecca had replied simply. "Full confessions from all of you, signed and witnessed. Complete restitution of stolen territorial funds, and permanent exile from Texas, if any of you are found within the borders of this republic after 30 days. You'll be arrested and hanged for treason." Representative Hayes had started to protest. "You can't possibly expect us to simply—" His words had been cut off as Rebecca had drawn a small pistol from beneath her dress, the weapon appearing with the fluid motion that months of training had made instinctive. "Gentlemen," she had said with deadly calm, "you seem to be laboring under the misconception that this is a negotiation. It's not. You're going to sign those confessions, or you're going to die in this room. The choice is entirely yours." The next hour had tested everything Rebecca had learned about psychological warfare during her time with War Eagle's warriors. Managing 4 desperate men who were individually intelligent and collectively dangerous required the kind of tactical thinking that went far beyond simple intimidation. Bank President Whitman had been the first to break, his businessman's instincts recognizing that exile was preferable to death. He had signed his confession with shaking hands, admitting to his role in financing Morrison's operations and laundering the stolen territorial funds through his institution. Federal Land Commissioner Bradford had followed, His confession revealing the full scope of the fraudulent land filing scheme and implicating officials in Washington who had been complicit in the conspiracy. Representative Hayes had proven more stubborn, arguing that Rebecca would never escape. Austin alive if she killed sitting government officials. His resistance had ended when Rebecca had calmly explained that she was no longer operating alone, that War Eagle's warriors were positioned throughout the city, ready to eliminate anyone who threatened her mission. "You've allied yourself with savages," Hayes had snarled as he signed his confession. "I've allied myself with honorable people who understand the difference between justice and law," Rebecca had corrected. "Something you've apparently forgotten." Judge Morrison had been the last to surrender, his legal mind working frantically to find some escape from the impossible situation. When he had finally accepted that no such escape existed, his confession had been the most comprehensive, detailing not just the Thornton land conspiracy, but dozens of other corrupt schemes that had enriched him at the expense of Texas citizens. "You realize this destroys us all," he had said as he finished writing. "You destroyed yourselves the moment you decided that innocent lives were acceptable sacrifices for your greed," Rebecca had replied. "I'm simply making sure the consequences catch up with you." With the confessions completed and witnessed, Rebecca had faced her final challenge, ensuring that the documents reached honest officials who would act on them. Corruption in frontier politics was like a cancer that could spread, if not completely excised, and leaving any of the conspirators' allies in positions of power would simply create new opportunities for cover-ups and retaliation. The solution had come through an alliance Rebecca had never expected to forge. Captain Samuel Houston, nephew of the famous general and commander of the Austin Territorial Garrison, had proven to be one of the few completely honest officials in the territorial government. When Rebecca had presented him with the confessions and supporting evidence, his reaction had been swift and decisive. "Mrs. Thornton," he had said after reviewing the documents, "this conspiracy reaches higher than I had feared. Rooting out all the involved parties will require martial law and a complete investigation of every territorial office. Whatever it takes, Captain. These men killed my husband and tried to steal our land. But more than that, they've betrayed every honest settler who trusted the territorial government to protect their rights." Houston had nodded grimly. "I'll need your testimony for the military tribunal. Are you prepared to face cross-examination from the best lawyers these men can afford?" Rebecca had smiled with grim satisfaction. "Captain, I've faced Comanche war chiefs, territorial judges and hired killers. I think I can handle a few lawyers." The trials that followed had become legendary in Texas legal history. Rebecca's testimony had been devastating in its clarity and comprehensiveness, while the physical evidence she had gathered had made denial impossible. The confessions, obtained under duress, but legally admissible due to the treason charges, had provided the framework for prosecutions that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Judge Morrison and Representative Hayes had been executed for treason, their deaths serving as warnings to other corrupt officials throughout Texas. Bank President Whitman and Land Commissioner Bradford had been sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison after their sentences were commuted in exchange for cooperation in identifying other corrupt networks. But for Rebecca, the legal victories had felt hollow compared to the personal cost of achieving them. James was still dead, their dreams still shattered, their future still uncertain. Standing on the steps of the Austin courthouse as the final verdicts were read, Rebecca had found herself facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. The territorial government, grateful for her service in exposing the corruption, had offered her significant compensation along with official recognition as a hero of the Republic. She could return to her homestead, use the water rights to build the agricultural empire that she and James had dreamed of, and live as a wealthy and respected member of Texas society. Everything she had lost could be restored, possibly even improved upon. But the woman who stood on those courthouse steps was no longer someone who could find satisfaction in such a conventional future. Months of living with War Eagle's people had shown her possibilities she had never imagined, while her campaign against corruption had revealed abilities she had never known she possessed. War Eagle himself had been waiting for her at the edge of Austin, his presence both a reminder of where she had found purpose and an invitation to continue walking the path they had begun together. "The white man's justice has been served," he had observed as they rode together toward the setting sun. "But there are other injustices that still require attention, other innocent people who need protection from those who would prey upon them." Rebecca had understood immediately what he was offering, a life dedicated to protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty, operating outside the boundaries of conventional law, but guided by a code of honor that transcended racial and cultural divisions. It would mean giving up any chance of a normal life, she had said, though she already knew what her answer would be. "Normal lives are for normal people," War Eagle had replied with a slight smile. "You ceased to be normal the moment you survived Morrison's fire." As they had ridden west toward the hills where War Eagle's band waited, Rebecca had felt the final pieces of her old identity falling away. The farmer's wife, who had hung laundry behind a peaceful cabin, was truly gone, replaced by something the frontier had never seen before, a woman who could move between two worlds, serving justice where the law could not reach. Years later, when settlers around campfires told stories of mysterious protectors who appeared to defend the innocent against outlaws and corrupt officials, they would speak of a woman who rode with Comanche warriors, but dressed like a lady when she appeared in courtrooms to testify against the guilty. They called her the Ghost of San Rafael, after the mission where Morrison had met his end. Some said she was a spirit seeking vengeance for all the innocent people killed by frontier violence. Others claimed she was a government agent working outside official channels to maintain order where law enforcement could not reach. The truth was simpler and more complex than any of the legends. Rebecca Thornton had become exactly what circumstances had demanded, a protector who understood that sometimes justice required stepping outside the law, and that the price of civilization was eternal vigilance against those who would exploit its weaknesses. She had found purpose in the ashes of her destroyed dreams, and in doing so had become something that neither the civilized world nor the wilderness could have created alone. She was a bridge between two ways of life, dedicated to protecting the innocent regardless of their race or background. The woman who had once dreamed of growing corn and raising children in peaceful Texas had instead grown into something far more important, a guardian who ensured that other families might live the peaceful lives that had been stolen from her. In the end, perhaps that was justice enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.